Western economists call them collapsing towns. Over half of Poland's 255 mid-sized cities classified as threatened, marginalized, dying. But they're missing the most important part of the story, because while Germany's industrial heartland rusts and France's villages empty out, Poland's so-called isolated towns are forging an economic model that rivals are too bureaucratic and too slow to copy. Here's how they turned crisis into Poland's competitive advantage. Let's be clear about something up front. When foreign analysts look at Polish towns ranging from 15,000 to 100,000 people and label them collapsing, they're applying Western frameworks to a Polish reality they don't understand. They see depopulation, unemployment, declining industry, and they write obituaries. They're not seeing the whole picture. Yes, researchers identified more than half of Poland's 255 towns as threatened by marginalization, using indicators like unemployment rates, registered businesses, and municipal revenues. That sounds catastrophic if you don't understand what those numbers actually represent. These aren't failures, they're pressure tests. Because here's what happened. In 1989, when communism fell, Poland didn't gradually transition to a market economy. It was thrown into one. State-owned factories that employed entire towns shut down almost overnight. The domino effect was immediate. Workers lost jobs, local businesses collapsed, municipal budgets evaporated. This wasn't decay, this was surgery. Poland had to cut out the diseased tissue of a Soviet economic model that never worked in the first place. And while Western Europe coasted on post-war industrial infrastructure and welfare systems, they're only now realizing are unsustainable. Poland's smaller towns absorbed the shock of transformation in a single generation. The question isn't why these towns struggled. The question is, how did they survive when similar-sized towns across Western Europe, with far more resources and stability, are now entering the same death spiral Poland faced 35 years ago? And more importantly, what did Poland learn that its rivals didn't? To understand how these towns work today, you need to understand the scale of what they survived. When the Berlin Wall fell, Poland's economy didn't just change, it was rebuilt from rubble. State-owned enterprises that employed thousands shut down within months. In towns built around a single factory or mine, that meant total economic collapse. But here's where the narrative splits from what Western media tells you. They frame this as tragedy. Poland frames it as liberation. Because yes, factory closures created systemic unemployment. Yes, nearby businesses suffered when workers lost income. Yes, people migrated abroad or to larger Polish cities looking for work. But every single one of those outcomes was the cost of shedding an economic system designed to keep people dependent, passive, and poor. Think about what those factories actually provided. Workplace-linked nurseries, subsidized canteens, medical care tied to your employment, cultural programs, holiday retreats. It sounds comprehensive until you realize it was a control mechanism. You didn't just lose your job if the party decided you were a problem. You lost healthcare, childcare, and community access all at once. The shift to a free market broke that system. And when local authorities in these shrinking towns lost revenue after industrial closures, they cut cinemas, cultural centers, libraries, all the Soviet-era services that were really just propaganda delivery systems. So yes, the transition was brutal. Forecasts say almost half of these towns will lose more than 10% of their residents by 2030. Some saw citizens turn to the grey economy just to survive. But Poland wasn't trying to preserve a failed system. It was clearing ground to build something better. And while Western Europe enjoyed decades of stability, Poland's isolated towns learned a lesson their richer neighbors are only now starting to face. You cannot rely on a single industry, a single employer, or a single government safety net. You adapt or you vanish. Now here's where it gets interesting, because while these towns were losing population and revenue, something unexpected was happening beneath the surface. The same people who'd been raised in a system that punished initiative were suddenly improvising. They call it kombinować in Polish, creative problem solving, making it work with what you have. When formal jobs disappeared, people found informal ones. When factories closed, they started small businesses. When the state stopped providing, families stepped in. Multi-generational households became economic units. Grandparents watching children so parents could work, remittances flowing back from family members who'd moved abroad. This wasn't desperation. This was Polish entrepreneurship in its rawest form. And migration? Western analysts frame it as brain drain, as if young Poles leaving for the UK or Germany was a failure. But here's what they miss. Those workers weren't abandoning Poland. They were gaining capital, skills, and networks to bring back. Now, Poland wasn't naive about the challenges. These towns are aging rapidly. In some of them, a third of residents will soon be retired. And there's a housing paradox that sounds absurd until you understand it. Even as populations shrink, many towns face housing shortages. Why? Because older residents stay in homes they own and almost no new construction happens in shrinking markets. On paper, that looks like stagnation. But Poland saw it differently. These weren't problems to solve with subsidies or bailouts. They were puzzles requiring structural innovation. And while France, Germany, and the UK were spending billions propping up declining industrial regions with government programs that just delayed the inevitable, Poland was experimenting. Some experiments failed. Towns that couldn't adapt kept shrinking, but 3 towns, Elk, Wajtał, and Poltusk, defied every projection. They're not just stable, they're set to grow. What did they figure out that everyone else missed? The answer came from an unexpected direction: the internet. Not social media, not e-commerce. The ability to work remotely. Because while Germany's workers were still commuting 2 hours into Frankfurt and France's labor laws were strangling flexibility, Poland quietly passed a labor code reform in 2023 that formalized remote work regulations. It wasn't flashy, it didn't make international headlines, but it was a weapon. Here's why. A software developer in Warsaw earns a competitive salary but pays Warsaw rent, Warsaw childcare costs, and sits in Warsaw traffic. That same developer working remotely from a town of 20,000, same salary, half the living costs, no commute, better quality of life. Suddenly, Poland's isolated towns weren't liabilities. They were assets. High-speed internet arrived in even the smallest towns. Infrastructure investment that Western Europe took for granted in cities but neglected in rural areas. Poland laid fiber everywhere. And when COVID forced the world into remote work, Polish towns were already positioned to capitalize. Northwestern towns were the most competitive. Eastern towns lagged behind. But here's the key finding: small towns became more heterogeneous in competitiveness over time, even as overall competitiveness improved. Translation: Poland's small towns weren't uniformly succeeding or failing, they were specializing. Some became logistics hubs. Some attracted remote tech workers. Some leveraged proximity to natural areas for tourism. The ones that adapted thrived. The ones that waited for government rescue didn't. And this is where Poland's model diverges sharply from its Western rivals. Germany tries to save every declining town with subsidies. France centralizes everything in Paris and wonders why rural areas die. The UK lets market forces hollow out the north while London absorbs all growth. Poland let towns compete, adapt, and specialize. The strong survived, the weak consolidated. And the result? A distributed economic model that's far more resilient than the top-heavy systems collapsing across Western Europe. Because when one Polish town struggles, others compensate. When Warsaw overheats, smaller towns absorb the overflow. It's not centrally planned, it's emergent, and it works. So here's what Poland's isolated towns actually are. They're not collapsing. They're laboratories. Every challenge they faced after 1989, job loss, depopulation, aging demographics, housing mismatches, is now hitting Western Europe's mid-sized towns. The difference? Poland's towns have 35 years of hard-earned solutions. And the remote work revolution? That's the force multiplier. Because Poland didn't just survive the post-Soviet shock. It built an economy flexible enough to let people live where they want while earning competitive wages. A Pole can now raise a family in Byto with clean air, low crime and tight-knit community, while working for a company in Berlin, London or San Francisco. That's not a consolation prize. That's a strategic advantage Western Europe can't replicate without dismantling decades of rigid labor law and centralized planning. And it's already working. Plesiu and Chorzow, two towns written off as declining, used the remote work era to attract new residents and retain existing ones. They're not anomalies, they're proof of concept. Now think about the broader implications. Hundreds of thousands of Poles currently living in the UK, Ireland, and Germany, earning foreign wages, paying foreign taxes, sending kids to foreign schools. Many went because Poland couldn't offer opportunities at home. But what happens when they can work for a British company from a Polish town? When they can earn London money with pull-tusk costs, they come home, and when they do, they bring capital, skills, networks, and experience. They start businesses, they invest locally, they raise the next generation as Poles, not as diaspora. This isn't a rescue plan. It's an economic repatriation strategy that no other European country has even thought to attempt, because no other country was forced to build the infrastructure and flexibility that Poland now has. So when foreign economists label these towns collapsing, they're revealing their own blind spots. They're measuring by inputs that no longer matter: factory jobs, municipal revenues, population size, while missing the outputs that do: adaptability, distributed growth, and resilience. Poland's isolated towns aren't isolated anymore. They're connected, flexible, and out-competing their Western rivals at a fraction of the cost. And that's the blueprint for Poland's future. Not bigger cities, but smarter towns. Not centralized control, but distributed innovation. Not bailouts for the past, but infrastructure for what's next. Subscribe to Economics Edge to see how Poland keeps turning challenges into advantages, while the rest of Europe struggles to keep up.